Well, good evening, everybody, and ladies and gentlemen, and colleagues and friends. On behalf of Professor Julian Crampton, who's the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Brighton, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to this first in our series of distinguished lectures in our Festival of Research. And I'd like to thank Professor Alan Tomlinson and Professor Phil Ashworth, who helped us put these occasions together. And as Hugh has said, my name is Bruce Brown, and I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research in this university. And in that capacity, I can tell you that we only recognise two types of research in the university. The first is applied research, and the second is yet to be applied research. And in that context, we hope that the work that we are doing has a real impact in the world around us and on many of the challenges facing societies today. And one of the extensions of our work has been the Community University Partnership Programme, known as CUP, which has won many awards for the university for the renowned work that it has undertaken over the years. And we also hope on occasions like this that we're able to bring wider issues such as these to a public audience in order to discuss the concerns that we have and the work that we're doing. So this brings me to the first distinguished speaker in this series of lectures, Dr. Etienne Wenger, to whom the university was proud to award an Honorary Doctor of Science in 2010. And Dr. Wenger is a world leader in the field of social learning. His book, Communities of Practice, Learning, Meaning and Identity, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 1998, is now a standard text that has gathered close to 24,000 citations on Google Scholar and an army of followers and advocates. And Dr. Wenger's thesis that learning cannot be reduced to a simple process of knowledge transmission has radical implications for all of the communities that we inhabit. His view that learning is an inherent dimension of everyday life helps to reframe this as a fundamentally social process in which we engage in every day of our lives. And without further ado, to tell you more about this, could you please give a warm Brighton welcome to Dr. Etienne Wenger.
Well, thank you for this welcome. I really appreciate being here. And yeah, I do have a special connection with this university, having received my first and only honorary PhD, which is great. You get another PhD, you don't have to do anything for it. So, this evening, what I thought I would try to do is to give a sense of what a social learning theory is about, what it is trying to do. And we heard before that you're trying to do applied research or research yet to be applied. I guess I'm in a yet to be applied category, but I'm not even sure that one would call what I'm doing research. It's theory building. And basically theory building has to do with creating a framework, creating a vocabulary that allows you to tell certain stories about the world. And this vocabulary that I'm going to talk about was created in the context of an institute. It was called the Institute for Research on Learning, to which I was invited to participate. It had a lifespan of about 10 years between 87 and 97. And the idea of that institute was to rethink learning. It was in response to a report by the Department of Education in the US called A Nation at Risk. You can imagine what this report was saying. You don't even have to read it. And so John C. Brown, at the time was director of Xerox PARC, convinced the Xerox Foundation to bring together scholars from different disciplines to just say, well, schools of education are going to do research on how to teach this better or that better, but somebody ought to take on the task of thinking, what assumptions are we making about learning that gives rise to the kind of institution that this report is talking about. So it was like, stepping back and saying, okay, what is it that we think, what is our theory of learning that gives rise to institutions like this? And so a colleague of mine, Jean Lev, and I decided that one way to step back would be to step back in time and go back to apprenticeship as an age-old way of learning, and to think, what can we learn from apprenticeship about a general theory of learning? By the way, not that we wanted to go back to apprenticeship. That was not the point. Apprenticeship has all kind of issues as a system, including indentured labor and all that. So, but the point was, if we want to go back before the institution of schooling to think about learning as a phenomenon of its own, here's a good place to start. And Jean was at the time, she had been studying tailoring in East Africa. And so in the first instance of the theory, we were looking at learning as a trajectory into a community. And why were we looking at a community? Because apprenticeship, when you say the word apprenticeship, for many people, it conjures a relationship between a master and a student. But when we were looking at actual cases of apprenticeship in different historical contexts, what we found is that a lot of the learning does not take place in direct relationship with a master. Often the master is way too imposing a figure for you as a young apprentice to go ask a question about your little problem. So you find another apprentice who is a little ahead of you, and you engage in a learning interaction with that other apprentice. And having done this observation, we needed a name for this living curriculum that we were observing in the world, and we called that a community of practice. So this concept that has given me a whole career was actually at very humble birth in giving a name to this living curriculum that we saw around a master that served as a kind of social structure for the apprentice to move into. And so the important aspects of this process that we, if you will, extracted from apprenticeship to apply to a more general theory of learning was to place learning in a context of a variety of processes. And these are the processes that we were focusing on. And I'm going to illustrate that with a small story that happened to me at the time. I was at the time thinking, about what are we. It's interesting because I remember talking with someone and said, she said, "Oh, you have to be patient with me. I'm trying to understand what communities of practice is about." And in some sense, I am too. I realized, I'm still trying to understand what is it that we are trying to get at. And I remember one evening having an insight into what we were trying to do. And I was at a friend's house, and that friend served me a glass of wine. So I drank a bit of it, and he asked me, "So what do you think?" I was stopped short because I know very little about wine. There must be something wrong with me because sometimes the cheaper the wine is, the better it tastes, So you know that you don't understand the whole thing. So I said, "Well, it's quite good." And then he, maybe seeing my surprise, said, "Etienne, this is a really good bottle." Oh. Turns out, and I didn't know that at the time, but it turns out that this friend is a wine taster. And he has a little club, and they get together and they talk about wine. And so he started to let me know why this was a good glass of wine. And to me, it was like the discovery of a parallel universe. Because for me, it was like an okay glass of wine, But for him, it was a symphony of taste that was very poetical, very beautiful. Like, there was chocolate there and strawberry somewhere else, and, I mean, it was amazing. There was a little bit of oak. I don't remember where, you know. And then he kind of goes into a state of trance and tells me, and this one, you know, it's got a really good purple in the nose. Now, I could imagine strawberry here, but purple in the nose, you know, the first thought I had is, yeah, people who drink a lot of wine tend to have a purple nose. I knew that's not what he meant, you know. You know, I knew, and actually I thought, because, you know, as a speaker, as a native speaker of French, you know, I've been speaking English for a while. I thought I knew what purple was, and I thought I knew what nose was. Turns out I was completely wrong, you know, because the nose he was talking about is not the nose of the person. It's the nose of the wine. Apparently people who know this stuff know that the wine has a nose, not you, you know. And the purple, I thought, you know, it was red wine. But apparently, white wine can have purple in it because it has nothing to do with color. It has nothing to do with wild berries or something like this. Okay, anyway, it was, to me, it was like, yeah, this is something we are trying to get at with this theory, is that a human practice, like wine tasting, really gives rise to a certain experience of the world. But if you are not a member of that community, you can hear the words. You don't have a sense of what it's about, you know? And my insight was, interestingly, the table that's between us, he has an experience of a glass of wine, the same wine, we're both human beings, such different experience. He is a member of a community that has developed a practice. I am not a member of that community, and therefore, there is a boundary there. There's a boundary between us. It's not a bad boundary, you know. It's not like he was trying to make me feel stupid. He was on the contrary. He was giving me a little window into his community. This is the way that we do it in my world. He was opening his world to me, and I had this, and it was beautiful. I thought, wow, great. This is a really beautiful way of drinking wine. And actually, you know, that evening, not only did I realize this is what we're trying to do with this theory, to capture the fact that knowing is embedded in a practical experience of the world that is interpreted with respect to certain social practices. But another thing that happened to me was, I thought that was pretty neat to drink wine like that, you know? I thought, I'd like to know how to do that, you know? And so, what I had to do was to, you know, bring my little board of trustees inside, you know, and we had a strategic conversation about, should we ask that friend, can I come on Thursday? You know, because I realized if I want to know what purple in the nose is, I'm going to have to go to these meetings. I'm going to have to drink a lot of wine in the company of those people who know how to talk about it until I can say for myself, yes, this has good purple in it. But my board of trustees decided that with the few years that you have left on this planet, I think you're going to stick with beer. You know? I mean, we decided, after a very short strategic conversation, that we were going to be satisfied with this short window into this practice and move on with all the things that I want to do with building learning theory and all that. You know? So, from that, we can start talking about what we're trying to do with this learning theory. First, the fact that learning has to be an experience of meaning, an interpretation of the world, and the ability to interpret the world in a new way. So, learning as an experience of being alive is really central to the human experience of learning. You see, for me, in that institute, it was a multidisciplinary institute. We had all our fights. We fought for about a year before we could do any work because everybody had a different idea of what learning was and what it meant to do learning and so on and so forth. For me, I was coming from cognitive science, computer science, you know. And for us, we couldn't deal with meaning, you know, because meaning was always outside of the model, you know. It's like the computer sending you your paycheck, you know. It hopes that it's meaningful to you because for it, it's just zeros and ones. You see what I mean? So you have to give it meaning. Yeah, this makes sense. The taxes, yeah, this makes all sense. You see what I mean? So the model is, the meaning is outside of the model. Here we were looking at those apprentices, or in my experience of the class of one, meaning is central to what it means to know. So a theory of learning is fundamentally anchored in the ability to negotiate new meanings as a human being. And you may say, well, this seems pretty obvious. You know, so I was explaining the theory to a group of graduate students, and one of them said, what you're saying seems like total common sense to me. Am I missing something? And it was like, no, you're not missing it. It's a way of talking about the world that gives a shade to your experience. So it's not that I'm talking about something you don't know. I'm just giving voice to something that you already know. And it's important. That's one of the functions of social theory, is to allow us to tell certain stories about our experience as human beings in a way that makes sense. Now, you know, there are lots of things. A good novel can do that to you too. The difference between a good novel and social learning theory, or social theory in general, is that social theory is a more technical vocabulary. So what I'm doing here is I'm talking about some of the technical terms that we have technicized, if you will, in that theory. Okay, so meaning is an important one. Another one is practice. Is that expression, purple in the nose, is not something that he came up with that evening. It's something that belongs to a practice that he has learned, and it's a way of talking, it's a way of giving each other instruction about how to drink wine and how to taste it. So it's part of a practice, but it's part of a practice that is the characteristic of a community. It's not a practice that is floating in the ether. It's the characteristic of a community. And it has all the complexity of a social community, in the sense that who decides what counts as practice, who decides. For instance, it would have been interesting that evening for me to fake it. You see what I mean? I also work as a consultant, so I know how to do that. To say, okay, no, you're right. No, fantastic purple in I love it. You know what I mean? It would have been interesting to know how long I could last in that community, faking it. How long I could, you know, do my little thing. Oh, yeah, no, fantastic. I love this strawberry and so on and so on. Until somebody says, strawberry on this one? You must be kidding, you know? So it's interesting to think about practice as a way by which a community defines competence and recognizes who is a member and who is not. And it doesn't matter what your practice is. You know, it could be a practice of engineering, it could be a practice of wine tasting, it could be a practice of being a gang on a street, you know? But you can recognize, yeah, I can recognize you as a member of that practice. I can see the way you walk, that you know exactly how to, you know, how to behave yourself according to what we define as competence in this context. You know? But the definition of competence, by the way, is always, it's always a matter of who has the power to decide what competence is. You know, we were just talking at the reception before coming here about how difficult it is to be a graduate student, how difficult it is to do a PhD. And in some sense, doing a PhD is entering a community. And in some sense, you have to show that you understand the competence. And that's why we ask a PhD student to do a lit review, right? Because we want to say, you have to honor the history of our community. And not only that, but for PhD students, we ask them to contribute to that practice. We ask them to know the practice well enough that you know what little bit of research is going to just push that practice a bit further. And to me, when I read a dissertation, that's always what I'm looking for. Are you telling me something that makes a difference to how I understand the world? You know, that's a very difficult thing to do. And you know very well that when you go for your viva, you know, there you are, you know, and you say, I think I'm a member of this community, and you have all these serious, important people who look at you and say, do you think so? Is he? Is she in? You see what I mean? The definition of competence and a claim to competence is actually a very fundamental thing about human learning. And you know, when you say this to scientists, they kind of say, well, no, but we have methods. That is true, you know. But it is fundamentally a social process of defining a discourse and deciding what counts as proper contribution to that discourse. I would say that one of the fundamental things that happened in the Renaissance when the so-called modern science was born is a socialization of the process of defining truth. Moving from the process of purifying your heart to move lead into gold, to a process of making contestable statement to a community. And that community looking at it and say, yeah, we accept that statement. It helps us move forward, or no, we refuse that statement. So, in some sense, what I'm talking about is very well known to you, because this notion that it is a community, it takes a community to have a competence is something that you all know, because that's very much what your life is about. And then finally, this notion of identity. You see, when I made the decision that I was not going to ask my friend to visit his community that Thursday, I was looking at my trajectory. I was looking at who I'm becoming, you know. And I decided that what I was becoming was not going to go through that detour into wine tasting. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you that I still don't know. You know, you can give me a glass of wine, red wine, white wine, whatever, and I still cannot tell you if it has purple in the nose or not, you know? So it's really embarrassing because I've used this story a lot, you know, but it's not actually embarrassing. Actually, I'm not embarrassed because I don't have any investment in that community. My identity is not invested in that community. And because of that, I am not accountable. I don't feel accountable to what that community knows. I can let them have their wine, have fun. For me, my identity is invested somewhere else. And I think that's really important, you know, to understand. So for those of you who are in education, to understand what gives you accountability, because people often ask me, so what's the theory of motivation in your learning theory? You know? And it has a lot to do with who you are becoming, you know. Is there a trajectory, a meaningful trajectory that can give what you are acquiring? It's like this little tailor apprentice who is learning how to sew that button. It makes a lot of sense to focus on that technique because it's part of becoming a certain kind of person. You know? So meaning and becoming are essential part of this theory. And so one of the problems that a theory like this, because a theory has to be applied, it's only useful if it helps us understand things, you know? So in that sense, I completely agree with you. A theory is a piece of research that's waiting to be applied. So if you apply it to our current institutions of schooling, you'd say, well, you know, we focus very much on the technical aspect of learning, but often in our schools, we don't focus very much on the meaning and on the becoming, you know. We have curricula that are very well structured, but often leave students kind of wondering, okay, who am I? What does that have to do with me, you know? And I'm not saying, you know, I'm not trying to romanticize I'm not trying to say, oh, you should ask students, you know, what do you feel like learning today, you know? I'm saying there is a discipline here, also a discipline about identity, you know, that is a trajectory, and you move, and there are demands. Okay, you're interested in the guitar, fine, but you've got to go through your scales. I mean, what I'm saying is that, but even at that level, right? If I think about my own experience of schooling, because I was a good student, so school was kind of easy for me, but I was never asked to become somebody. You see what I mean? Except, you know, just having good grades to kind of float around and do my little thing. I was never asked to be really good at anything, you know, to be really challenged by who you're becoming. You see, because when you are really on a trajectory, it's transformative, you know? Because somebody was asking me, you know, what about, not everything about learning is fun. I'm not talking about fun, you know? I'm talking about meaningfulness. It's a bit different, you know? For me, I write books and I write papers, and I remember my daughter was very surprised to hear that every time I write something, I go through a dark tunnel of that moment where you think this is not coming together. This chapter is not going to work. You know what I mean? I don't know if you have experienced that. But, you know, it's like, who am I, you know? Am I really a person who can do that? You cannot doubt yourself, and you have to kind of like, I've learned to go through it, you know? I've learned to wait a bit longer, you know, not to give up, in some sense, you know? That, okay, there is usually light at the end of the tunnel, and you recover and you become somebody again. But this is an important experience. Schooling never gave me that experience of real learning, you know, of real meaningful learning. So it is a theory that will ask certain questions of an institution of learning. And so people say, okay, so what is learning from this theory's perspective? Well, it's a tension between competence as socially defined and your own experience. In the same way that, you know, there was my experience of a glass of wine and a competence manifested in front of me. And it's in that tension that learning takes place. But it cannot take place both ways. You know, it can take place because you develop an experience of a glass of wine that a wine taster can recognize. Yeah, you know, yeah, you understand there's a lot of purple in this wine. But the other way happens too. And that's why we ask our graduate students to contribute to the practice, to change our practice. Because you can bring your experience and say, hey, maybe one day this expression was not in that community, and somebody says, you know, try this. This wine really has good purple in the nose. And maybe the colleagues around the table started laughing and said, no, you've been smoking, not drinking. There's no such thing as purple in the nose. And you have to negotiate with them. You have to push them. No, accept my experience as part of the practice. And in that sense, you push the practice along. So we should not think of social practice as something static. We should think of some social practice as something that is constantly negotiated by people making different claims to that practice. Claims that can be accepted or refused by the community. So learning happens both ways, whether it's the competence that's pulling the experience or the experience that's pulling the practice, that's pulling the competence. So you could think now, and this is more like the second phase for those of you who are familiar with those books. This is really the switch between the 1991 book, where we took the community of practice for granted, if you will, and we viewed learning as a trajectory into it, to a second phase in the theory, where we assume that learning as a social engagement was fundamental, and then a community was formed when people over time developed and negotiated a kind of competence, whether this competence is engineering or, yes, I said, being a street gang or whatever. And you can see that there are different trajectories, and they're not like aligned like a little soldier, you know? They negotiate with each other. This person was probably trying to take the competence somewhere else. And the community said, no, we're not going there. So maybe he said, you know, this wine has excellent electricity in the temple. And the community said, no, forget it. You go do your temples here. You know, we are staying on our path. You see what I mean? So you can see that tension between the person and the community in the process of defining competence. Now, this, you don't have to worry too much about this collage, but one big surprise is in how many different contexts this view, this perspective on learning has been found useful. Because actually, when we were doing this research, we thought it was going to be for education. But the first people who took up those ideas and did something with them were in business. Because in business, people were really struggling with, how come, because they had adopted the learning theory of schooling. So when they had a learning problem, they asked the training department to prepare a course. But the training department was always behind, By the time the course was designed, the market has moved on, and the course was obsolete, So for them, seeing learning as embedded in practice and part of practice was a very useful way to start thinking about how an organization is able to achieve what it wants to achieve. In that case, business success. But it could be also in government. Here, this is in the UK, municipal government forming communities. And actually, this is an interesting community. My wife and I were in Cape Town recently, and we were asked to facilitate the formation of a community among people who are worried about transparency and accountability in government finances. And that's a community of practice that is a complex one, because the stakeholders that can contribute to the development of that practice actually come from very different places. So we had some funders, we had some civil society organizations, we had some researchers who are doing evaluation, and part of the process of building a community among them was to negotiate, why should I talk to you? You funder, the reason I'm not learning is because all I'm doing all the time is to fulfill the requirement of your grant. Your grant has monitoring and evaluation requirements, and all my energy is put into doing monitoring and evaluation so I can get the next grant. That's why the field is not learning. And same thing with the academics. The academics, are saying I need to write papers. I cannot just serve your purpose. So it was interesting. There was a very complex community that was kind of like at the boundary between many existing community and the need to define a new practice, which is a practice of learning across multiple stakeholders. And the meeting went pretty well. I think there is a community that's going to come out of it, but we're not sure yet, because there's enough tension within that community that it could still fall apart. But it is interesting that today, a lot of our work has to do with these very complex communities that are not defined by a simple job, which is 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the work that we were doing were more simple, homogeneous community defined by a job. And now they are defined by a challenge that involves a practice. We need to develop a new practice, but across multiple perspectives. So that will take us to a brief overview of where I think the learning theory is going. I was asked once by the Open University in the UK, so what does your theory say about our work? And of course, the Open University has become very, very good at taking a profession or taking a body of knowledge and creating a curriculum. They invest, I think, £4,000 or something when they design a course, And they design this very well constructed course, and then they have, of course, all the processes to deliver that course, And so I was thinking, but our theory would not view the course as the body of knowledge, because the body of knowledge, from this theory's perspective, is much more like a complex landscape where you have different communities, research, regulatory bodies, and so on and so forth, kind of almost competing for defining what counts as knowledge, what counts as good practice, And then learning becomes kind of a trajectory through that landscape. So learning in this phase of the theory is no longer a simple trajectory into one community, but a more complex trajectory through a landscape of different communities. And so, conceptually, what we need a language for is not simply competence, which is defined with respect to a single community, but also a notion of knowledgeability that is defined with respect to a whole landscape of practice. And so, if we think about what that looks like, well, here's a person is, it could be a teacher or a nurse or somebody who's learning something. And you can see different practices that, and you do that, I'm sure that you train nurses or psychologists or whatever, and, you're hoping that what you do is going to have some effect. And you may be wrong, but you're hoping that it's going to have some effect on their practice, right? But they are not the only ones hoping that, because there are people who do research, they're also hoping that what they do is going to have some effect on how that person practices. There are colleagues who have some opinions as well from their own experience. You have professional bodies that define a certain ethics and way of being and so on and so forth. You have regulatory bodies, and in some sense, you could view a knowledgeable professional as someone who is able to transform that landscape into a useful moment of engagement in practice. So you're a teacher, and you have to deal with a certain student. You have to translate all these things that are happening in the landscape of your profession into a meaningful moment for that student. Or a nurse, same thing, or a doctor, whatever. Because these practices don't necessarily always agree with each other. Okay, so should I give you that test? My training says, yeah, I should give you the test. But the research says, well, we don't know if this test is really always very good. And the regulatory body says, yeah, you should always give the test. And your CEO says, the CEO of your trust says, we need to save money. You see what I mean? And as a professional, in some sense, you become the representative of that landscape to a person who has some need. And your professional knowledgeability is that you know how to transform that complex landscape into that meaningful moment of mutual engagement. And of course, what we know is that the landscape is not getting simpler, it's getting more complicated, because there are new entrants now in all sorts of ways, that make the question more complex. Should you follow the blog of that nurse in India who is doing very good work in Mumbai, or whatever? Should you follow the Twitter feed of your CEO who is sending stuff into the ether? So the landscape is more going into the direction of complexity than simplification. And I think we need to make, from this theory's perspective, we need to make a distinction between what I would call vertical knowledge and horizontal knowledge. We need to make a distinction between knowledge that has to subsume your experience and knowledge that is engaging your experience. So if you think about the age of the universe, it's more like vertical knowledge. It's a community that has the right to say that the universe is 15.4 billion years old. Your experience is not that relevant because you don't have the tools to negotiate whether that works or not. You see what I mean? As opposed to, the kind of theories that I'm presenting, which is more horizontal knowledge. Your experience is how you can use this theory to make sense of the world. So we need to view the landscape of our practice as relationship between communities that are sometimes vertical, sometimes horizontal, and with risks, with learning risks, if you will, in both directions. So, because sometimes people think, oh, the internet is horizontalizing everything. And I think that's not quite true. We also have all sorts of vertical ways of managing, auditing, surveilling, and so on and so forth. So the world as a place to know is complex along both dimensions. So one way perhaps to describe learning in the 21st century from this perspective would be to say that there is a shift in the burden of identity from the community to the person. Now, I want to say that from this theorist's perspective, this is not that we are moving from a collective society to an individual society. Because learning is still that relationship between the social world and the person navigating that world. But if you are in a complex landscape, and if you are creating a unique trajectory through that landscape, there is no community that's going to define for you in a simple way what it means to be knowledgeable. You see? So if you lived in a little village in the UK in the 15th century, maybe you lived your whole life with a community, and that community was doing a lot of identity work for you, you know, in defining how you should be and what it is to be a good person and all that, you know. But if your trajectory is a very complex one, then the project of identity is more of a burden of you as a person. And so what I would like to end this talk with by saying, I think this theory is asking a question. Because a lot of our work in enabling learning has been in terms of curriculum. What's in the curriculum? What should a 12-year-old know? What should a 16-year-old know? And so this theory is saying, but there's a shift away from a simple definition of what one should know to a much more complex process of building a knowledgeable person. And so if you remember anything from this talk, is that question, it's a challenge, If it is true that the main learning problem for learners in the 21st century is who I am becoming, how do I pay attention to things that are going to help me become a meaningful person? Then we have to ask ourselves, what kind of institutions, now going back to this question, what theory, what assumptions about learning? If we make these assumptions about learning, what kind of institutions should we work towards creating that would help our student address this most difficult problem of learning in the 21st century, which is not access to curriculum, because curriculum, we have MOOCs, and, access to curriculum is somehow becoming unproblematic. What is really problematic, and for me too, my big learning problem is, of the 250 books that I should read every month, which one should I look? Which one should I take with me on this trip? That is the most difficult problem, for which I had no practice in my whole schooling, I tell you, because everything was prepared for me. This is the curriculum, learn it. So that practice of knowing how to learn in a complex world, I had no experience of. It's only now that I'm starting to say, oh my goodness, I have to make decisions here about who I'm becoming. In the same way that I had to decide whether or not to join the wine tasters. But it's a symbol. That little story is a symbol of something much more profound about the world that we are creating in the 21st century, if you think of the world as a curriculum, if you think of the world as a place of learning. So this is the question that I'd like to let you go back to your beautiful Brighton with after this talk. Okay, thank you very much.
Etienne, thank you very much for that very rich and lucid exposition. I believe you're prepared to answer some questions.
Yes, I would love to.
I found your talk fascinating, and there was one point you were talking about the Open University and its investment in taking repositories. And I heard a slight gasp behind me, because the previous Vice-Chancellor of the Open University is sitting over there.
By the way, it's not a critic. I think that from a social perspective and political perspective, the Open University is a fantastic institution. This idea that...
I just want to correct the amount of money men being
That's what the gas was for.
Oh, I see.
It's more like £1 million.
£1 million per course, okay. I stand corrected. But the order of magnitude is pretty close. I mean, what I'm saying is that, and they do it very well. You know, I should say that among institutions in the world, they are really right there, up there at the top. So I'm saying, I was certainly not putting the institution down at all. Yeah.
Brenda Gawley, you're familiar with John Seeley Brown, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his...
He was actually my mentor because he was the person who founded this institute and called me in to join as a graduate student.
Yeah, he's one of my gurus. I think he's absolutely marvelous. Yeah. One of the phrases that he used, I'm not sure if he still uses it, was he moved from I think, therefore I am, to I participate, therefore I am. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to link that up with where you ended your address, because somewhere in the middle was the participation, but not necessarily somewhere at the end.
Yes, so the theory has evolved. Actually, John was what I owe to John is also that when he first saw our work with Jean, you know, this first book that was called Situated Learning, we didn't realize what we had. You know, it was just a paper we had written. And he saw it and he says, you need to publish that. You know, you need to publish that as a book. So we extended it a little bit. So it would fill the whole book. Actually, there are lots of blank pages at the end. But because he said, this has to be published as a book because it's too important to just be published as a paper in a journal. So, you know, he was the one who saw what we had. And actually that way I think influenced that sentence that he used, I participate, therefore I am. And I would still say that is true, but if you move from looking at a single community to a landscape of practice, then I participate, therefore I am, is a more intense negotiation of how do you modulate your participation across multiple potential locations in the landscape. So the theory has not moved from a social theory to an individual theory. It is still in that relationship between the social world as structured as a place of the geography of competence of the social world, if you will, and the person negotiating who they are in that landscape, in that geography, but recognizing the multiplicity of potential forms of belonging and the tension of the person having to negotiate who they are in that complexity. Okay, so this notion of modulation, of identification. How much do I identify with the wine tasting community? And what kind of accountability? You see, identification is not free. I cannot say, I identify with the wine tasting community. I love them and this is me. Because they will say, wait a minute, you don't know what you're talking about. So there's an accountability that comes with identification, but how do you then modulate that as a way of learning or engage students in a way that they can modulate who they are in a way that encompasses the kind of accountability that you would like them to experience with respect to the courses that you're developing and so on and so forth. You know? And you know, I think this has profound implications pedagogically, because one part of that, because some people have interpreted my work as saying the pedagogical implications of this is that you should treat students as mathematicians, you should treat students as biologists. And that's, I think, a misinterpretation of this theory. On the contrary, there's no point teaching kids as if they were going to become mathematicians when one of 100,000 is going to, or maybe not even that, you know what I mean? So from a pedagogical standpoint, there's a notion of like, what does it take to organize a meaningful visit into some practice? And this is, I think, the pedagogical challenge that many institutions will have to respond to, you know, because, you know, from the point of view of modulating identity, you know, I was helping my son with his biology, it was last year, and I can tell you, his school has done him a great service with respect to biology. It has completely freed him because he knows he's never going to be a biologist. so a wonderful service that the school has done to simplify his life, that door is closed forever. Because really, the way people were teaching biology, and it's a good school, by the way. He was in a good school. But he had to learn about 20 terms every week. And he was tested on those terms, terms that you and I never use, I don't remember what they were, like names of little parts of cells and nucleid and all that stuff, And to me, the analogy I give is that he was taught biology. It's like as if I come and I say, oh, Angie, I have half a day in Brighton. Can you give me a sense of what Brighton is, And she's going to take me some clubs and whatever. She said, because I have makeup for these lights, that I would fit in all sorts of clubs in Brighton and all that. Great. I thought it would be very interesting. But what if she told me, you wanna know Brighton? Here is the map. Learn the names of the streets, and then we'll talk. You see what I mean? It would be such a bad way to give me an experience of Brighton. But I was thinking, this is what we do to this young kid. He's 14, This is the experience of biology that we give that kid. Learn all the names of the street. Now, if you are becoming a biologist, of course you have to know all these names. Because if you don't, people will say, what are you doing here? Go back to Biology 101. But no, what we need to do is to give him a different kind of experience that he can feel like, oh, that's what it's like to be a biologist. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe I want to do it, maybe not. And not everybody should become a biologist. That's not the point. But the point is, can we give people a meaningful visit of what a practice really is about without forcing them? It's almost like if you think of the landscape and there's this little hill of biology, right? Can we give kids a helicopter ride on the top of this mountain to give them an experience what it's like to be there without having to do the climbing? Of course, they cannot stay there. It's cheating, If you want to stay there, you need to do the climbing, for sure, But can we just give them a helicopter ride there?
No, we might have time for one or two more. I have to say, one of the things that always impressed me about John Seeley Brown, I think it was he who coined it when I was young, was the motto at Xerox PARC, which is, if you want to be certain of the future, then invent it. Which is philosophy. Are there any more questions? Could I ask you what my colleagues are thinking? I mean, I'm not sure I really know if this is a question or not. In your description of this community of learners, the assumption could be that they all have equal status, equal power, and equal authority. Is that the conditions in which that kind of community has to work, or is it disruptive?
Okay, so first of all, we use the term community when we talk about community of practice. That's the term we coined. We were not really thinking at that time. We just thought, oh, this is a community, and it has a practice, so it's a community of practice. There's a baggage that comes with the term community. Is this assumption that there are no issues of power, that community is just this haven of mutual love, No, I mean, if you define learning as a claim to competence that is going to be accepted or refused, then power is always part of learning. No learning that is without power, without issues of power, Now, it is also the case that now when we work with communities and we try to encourage communities to push their learning, then you have to ask yourself, in these relationships of power that are unavoidable, which voices are being silenced? So that would be a good... The work that we do, we tend to think about it as a social discipline of learning. So from a social discipline of learning, and not a cognitive discipline of learning, but from a social discipline of learning, you work with a group. An important thing you want to pay attention to is which voices are being silenced by the relationships of power. Not there is no relationship of power. If somebody has 30 years of experience and somebody just started, you want that person with a lot of experience to have more power. You see what I mean? Power is not a bad thing. Actually, from this theory's perspective, power is almost the way we learn. You know what I mean? We want the successful to have power. But of course, there's a price to it, is that these power relationships can indeed silence important voices that would help the community make progress. So you need to be the social discipline of learning is a very delicate dance between the past, which shapes power, and the future. As you say, invent the future. So if a community wants to invent its future, it has to become reflective on what kind of social structure gives rise to what kind of social learning capability.
Hi, my name's Daniel Marsden. I'm a learning disability nurse. I work in East Kent Hospitals Trust. My question is about stigma and how that relates to communities of practice. Mm-hmm. As a learning disability nurse and working with people with learning disabilities, I'm very aware of that past that you talked of and that knowledge base mm-hmm. that people have about how they believe they might be treated in the future, or and those professionals and how they might be treated by their colleagues and peers and the rest of the family, perhaps, of mm-hmm. nursing in this case. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in how that might appear or might map onto your ideas of community of practice.
Well, I mean, I don't want to paint a rosier picture than we have in the world today. Stigma is certainly an important question, and actually, a quick little story. I was working with a community of professionals, and it was a community that was you had mental health professionals in the community and learning disability professionals in the school, and they wanted to create a community to learn how to talk about kids, because they often had the same kids in their care, but viewed them very, very differently. So they were, and we were at a conference in Pennsylvania, and there were some of those kids who were going to do a show. They were going to do a kind of dance as part of the conference, you know. And so someone had the idea, let's bring the kids in. We're talking about them, and they are here. So it was a social learning intervention. Let's change the constitution of the group and see what learning effect it has, basically, if you view it from a social discipline of learning perspective. And it was exactly what you were saying. Because the whole conversation when you were just had the professional was, should we integrate the curriculum or segregate the curriculum? That was the big question. And when the kids came in, they said, well, we don't care. But could we have a school culture that doesn't stigmatize the identity as so-called learning disabled? So I think you are putting your finger. If learning and identity are different aspects of the same coin, then of course being stigmatized is itself a learning disability, right? Okay, so yeah, from this perspective, certainly. Now, if I'm a principal and I'm in charge of a school, and I want to say, oh, let's get rid of stigma, you know, then the theory would also assume that it's more difficult than putting a few posters on the wall, you know, that practice, because it's a theory that talks about practice, changing practice is in a complex system like a school where you have a whole landscape of practices. You have the practices not just of the teachers and the administrators, but you have the practices of the kids that also have their little community, you know? And so the theory would also predict that it is very, very difficult to change culture, that you have to go deep into each practice, that you cannot change simply practice from the outside by convincing people or something like that. They also have to find a new identity. The bully also has to find a new identity because they are also struggling with an equation of identity that is difficult to solve. So certainly.
Two more questions. One over.
Yeah.
Anne Boddington, Dean of Arts. Can you say something about the notion of craft?
About?
Craft.
Yeah.
And what would you describe as the craft of learning?
Would you like to answer another question while you think about that?
No. I'm not sure there's a craft of learning, you know? So what I've talked about is a social discipline of learning, maybe if you want to call that a craft, I would love that to become a craft, yeah? Because I would love that notion that enabling learning capability is as much of a social craft as it is a cognitive craft. Now, cognitive is also important. So the fact that we know to teach, I don't know, arithmetic before algebra or whatever, this is also a craft, but it's a craft that is fairly well understood because for the whole of the 20th century has focused on that aspect of the craft, you know? But I would say there is another whole dimension which we have not fully explored, which is what about the travel, you know? What about telling a student, you know, you're at the University of Brighton, but I think that you should spend 3 months in Japan. That's really the best thing to do for your trajectory. You see what I mean? What kind of institution would have the craft of saying, this is your next step, you know? And the next step is not another course. We have lots of courses, but your next step is not another course. It's completely changing, jumping in a place of identity where your identity is not going to function, you know? The same way that when I moved to the US, my little Swiss guy identity didn't function, you know? I was trying to buy a second-hand car, you know? And for me, I'm an upper middle class Swiss, you see? And an upper middle class Swiss, you smile and you're really nice, and automatically in Switzerland, people see where you are in the social landscape and they respond in kind, right? Try to do that in a second-hand car lot in California, and your identity doesn't function, you know? You try to crank it up and it doesn't work. So maybe, see, this theory would say, okay, you need an experience like this. You see what I mean? So to start thinking about the craft of learning from what kind of relationship in the social world will be the next thing. You see what I mean? And whether you're looking at a person, you can say, oh, you need to go spend 3 months in Japan. I don't know. I'm just inventing off the top of my head. But you see, from you know, if you are with a community, you would start to pay attention to the social constitution of that community, to who has power, who doesn't, what kind of other communities this community should interact with. See, you start thinking of learning capability both inside communities, but also at the boundaries, you know, and we were just talking earlier about multidisciplinary, you know, this notion that there is a lot of learning potential at boundaries between communities. There's also a lot of wasted time at boundaries between communities because you are dealing with people who don't understand what you're doing and who don't appreciate it, right? So I can tell you in that institute, we fought for a year. So, you know, the boundary was difficult, and it was only because there was a strong institutional context for people to engage long enough that people didn't say, these anthropologists, they don't understand anything about modeling, you know? We can model, you know? We have a computer and we can model the behavior of a student on subtraction problems. These anthropologists with a little island and nice description, this literature, it has nothing to do with science. You see what I mean? So if you start thinking about the landscape, you can see that hills have different shapes. And, you know, how you construct a trajectory, how much time you spend at a boundary as opposed to climbing your hill, it's a bet, right? You start viewing learning as a kind of social bet. You see what I'm saying?
Angie Hart from the School of Nursing. I think Anne's question about craft, that just relates to a conversation I've had with you a lot about learning and techniques and kinesthetic learning, different kinds of learning that I still think you kind of are neglecting a bit, and maybe with this idea that you've got now, you're still continuing to neglect that a little bit, possibly. But that wasn't actually my question. My question was more for practitioners in the audience, because you were talking about COPS as a social history of learning in communities of practice and the way. But you've also done some work on social futures of learning through thinking about cultivating communities of practice and things like that. And I'm just wondering what this idea now where you're going, what does that look like in terms of more of a social future of learning? Okay. How does that shift? But probably a brief answer, because really I think we're supposed to be going.
Okay. I'll try to be brief. So first of all, yes, I'm neglecting a lot of stuff, right? But actually, I just wrote a paper reflecting on that, where I say in social theory, the way theory progresses is not by taking everything into account, but on the contrary, by saying very clearly what you are about and what you're not, so that you can plug and play with other theories. So it's called the plug and play principle of progress in social theory, which is different from the natural sciences, where theories tend to replace each other because they are more general. You know, I think the very, very general theory of learning, or social theories more generally, that try to encompass everything, tend to be reductionist. You know, so I would say learning styles and so on. There's already a theory with that. I don't think we need to reinvent it, but we need to see, okay, how do those two theories interplay? You know, because my learning theory is a very small theory that has a very small scope, you know. So people say, what's the difference between your theory and activity theory or actant network theory? Those are different perspectives, and we need to understand when they are compatible, when they are not, and how the puzzle of how we talk about the social world is created by multiple theories interacting. There's no theory of class in my theory. How can you do a social theory without talking about class? Class is, of course, it's everywhere, but there already is a series of class. Why don't we run a theory of class through a theory of cognitive practice, which is what Paul Willis did, for those of you who know his work. He basically ran Marxism through cognitive practice and came up with a wonderful description of why working class boys end up on the same shop floor as their father when they heard their father complain about it for their whole childhood, you know? So he did a very beautiful study of taking one theory and running it through another to come up with a more complex. So I think it's important not to expect one theory to do the whole work, but to expect theories to have almost like APIs, almost like ways that other theories can connect with them by saying, if you want to run through this theory, this is what you're going to have to. These are the few principles you can't break. You know. What was your other question? Oh, the future. Yeah. So if you start viewing things as a landscape, right? Because from the original theory's perspective, the problem was access, right? You enable learning by giving learners access to the practice, increasing access to the practice. Once you start looking at the whole landscape, then an intervention, a learning intervention, could be, for instance, this community that we were working with in Cape Town, you know? A kind of new social learning space where conversations that were not possible before can now happen. You see what I'm saying? And you do a bit of that work yourself when you engage parents to talk with researchers. You create a new space. You do an intervention in the social landscape that opens a new space. Whether that space ends up being a little hill of its own, that is a full practice of its own or not, it's, you know, maybe you cannot predict in advance, you know. But certainly this idea that creating new spaces within the landscape is actually a key learning intervention. Talking about learning craft is a key learning intervention. It's something that we're starting to work through to understand what it is.
Now, we have a couple of people who were queuing up for questions, but I'm not being rude, but I think we have to call this to a halt now because we're well over time and you've been very generous. And I have to test one of Etienne's theories. Because down in Brighton, I've got a crate of really cheap wine and one bottle of really expensive wine. See if you can tell the difference. But
well, I got myself into trouble here.
But I have to thank Etienne on behalf of everybody here for making the journey to come and see us. And I'm sure we're all going to leave the room much wiser and much richer for what you've said to us so generously this evening. You're always welcome in Brighton whenever you would like to come back, and we would love to see you here again in the community. So could everybody thank Etienne for his time?
Okay.